It was raining hard on a cold night in early November when she came up that dead-end road to Coldwater Lake, deep in the Adirondacks. Nora Hale was 27 years old, blind for 14 months, one hand on a white cane and the other counting off steps a stranger had given her that afternoon. She didn't have a home, she didn't have papers, and there wasn't a soul left in this world who still said her name out loud. All she wanted was somewhere dry to sit until morning, so she found the door, and she knocked. The door opened, and the man standing there was bare-chested, scarred from shoulder to hip, with a gun in his right hand. In New York, folks didn't say his name above a whisper. Dante Ferraro was 37, and 1 week out of every year, always the same week, he came to that house alone. No crew, no phone, nobody allowed past the gate. There was a room at the end of his hallway that hadn't been opened in 19 years, and the key never left his pocket. He looked at the soaked woman on his porch, staring straight past him at nothing at all, and he asked her who'd sent her. She told him a kind old woman in town had pointed her down this road. He shut the door in her face, and that should have been the end of it. But before that winter was over, the coldest man in New York would learn that the woman he'd turned away in the rain was the one thing he couldn't live without. If you believe nobody ever knocks on the wrong door by accident, then this story's for you. If it stays with you tonight, go ahead and leave a like, share it with somebody who could use a good story, and hit subscribe, because there's always another one coming. Now let's head back to that rainy road, and to the moment that door swung open. She didn't move for a long while after the door closed. The rain came down harder then, sheeting off the eaves and running cold along the back of her neck. And she stood there with one hand still lifted a little, the way a person does when they've been talking to someone who has walked away. Then she turned around. That was the trouble. She'd come up that road with a stranger's directions folded carefully in her head, and directions only work in one direction. Turn around and the whole shape of it collapses. The gravel had no edges she could trust. The wind was pushing the sound of the water around, so that the lake seemed to be on her left, then behind her, then nowhere at all. She went 4 or 5 paces out from the house and stopped, because she could feel that she was drifting, and drifting in open country with no landmark was how a person ended up in the water. So she came back. She found the step with the tip of her cane, sat down on the second one from the bottom, and pulled her knees up under the wet wool. She was not a woman who cried easily anymore. She had spent that particular currency in the first few months, and found there was nothing you could buy with it. So she sat, and she waited for morning the way you wait for a bus that may not run, and she kept her breathing slow, because panic used oxygen and warmth, and she had very little of either to spare. Inside the house, Dante Ferraro stood at the front window with the lamps off. He was not a man who lingered. In 20 years he had built a reputation on the fact that when he decided a thing, the thing was decided, and everybody moved. He'd shut the door. That was the decision. She would walk back down the road, and in the morning somebody in Ridgemont would give her a cup of coffee and a phone, and none of it would ever have anything to do with him. But she hadn't walked back down the road. He watched her go out a few steps and stop and come back, and something in the way she stopped bothered him more than he wanted it to. She wasn't performing. That was the piece he kept turning over. He had seen a great many people beg in his life. He knew what it looked like from every angle. He knew the wet eyes and the hands and the small theatrical collapse, and he knew the smarter version too, the one that pretends not to beg while making very sure you're watching. This wasn't either one. She had her back to the door. She wasn't calling out. She wasn't crying loud enough to be heard through the glass. She was simply sitting in the rain like a woman who had run out of options and was going to be quiet about it. He went to the study and pulled up the gate camera on the monitor and watched her there in grainy gray, and she still hadn't moved, and he found that he was standing when he could have been sitting. 5 minutes. 10. He told himself she was a plant. Somebody had thought this through, had figured out the 1 week a year, had picked a woman who couldn't see because a woman who couldn't see couldn't identify a face in a courtroom. It was a good theory. It was clean. He'd used cleaner ones to justify worse things. But a plant doesn't sit down in a 40-degree rain and wait, because a plant has a car half a mile back and a partner with a radio, and this one hadn't even taken the shelter of the eaves. 15 minutes. He thought about the fact that in about 3 hours she'd stop shivering, and that when a person stops shivering out in weather like that, it isn't good news. He thought about a body on his property in the morning, and told himself that was the reason, and knew while he was thinking it that it wasn't the reason, and disliked himself for the knowing. 20 minutes. He got a towel out of the hall closet and opened the door. She turned her head toward the sound, but she didn't get up. and she didn't say anything, and she didn't ask. He put the towel into her hands, and her fingers were so cold she nearly dropped it. He told her to come inside. She stood slowly, one hand on the cane and the other flat against the door frame, to find the height of the sill, and he did not offer his arm, and she did not ask for it. The kitchen was warm from the stove and smelled of coffee gone bitter on the burner. There was a deep chair by the fire in the next room. He didn't take her there. He put her in the straight wooden chair beside the kitchen door, the one nearest the way out, and she sat down in it without a word of complaint, as though she understood exactly what the chair meant and had been given worse. He set the rules while she dried her hair. One night, she'd sleep in the chair or on the floor by the stove, whichever she liked. She wouldn't go past the kitchen. In the morning, at first light, she'd be gone, and she'd never mention this house or this road to anybody living. She said, "All right." Not "thank you," just "all right." And Dante Ferraro stood there in his own kitchen with his arms folded, waiting for the gratitude he'd braced himself to refuse. And it never came, and for reasons he could not have explained to a single soul on earth. That bothered him worst of all. He let her get warm first, which was not kindness but method, because cold people say whatever gets them out of the cold, and he wanted answers that would hold. He pulled a chair around and sat facing her with the length of the kitchen table between them, and he started the way he always started, with the easy question, the one whose only purpose is to give you a baseline for the lies that come later. Full name. She said Nora Ann Hale. Maiden name Hale, she added, before he asked. Age 27. Born in Utica. He asked who sent her up that road. She said she didn't know the woman's name. He asked who was paying her. She said nobody had paid her anything since the 11th of March. He asked what was on the 11th of March, and she said that was the day the last check cleared. And then she stopped, because he hadn't asked for the story, and she wasn't going to volunteer it. That surprised him. Everybody volunteers. He asked her how she'd gone blind, and she answered him in the flat, unhurried way a woman reads off a grocery list. And that flatness was the first thing that got under his skin, because a story told in that voice has been told too many times to too many people who didn't care. There was a fire, she said, 14 months ago, at a nursery in Rye, down in Westchester County. Her husband died in it. His name was Julian Whitmore. She didn't die, but something in the smoke took her eyes, and she woke up 5 days later, in a hospital where nobody would tell her what day it was. He asked what happened after. She said his family came. They were good to her at the funeral, in front of people. Then there was a check and a bus ticket, and the ticket was one way. And the check was canceled before the bus reached Albany, and she'd found that out at a bank window in front of a line of 9 people who all got very quiet. She said it evenly. She didn't say it like a wound. She said it like weather. Dante didn't believe a word of it. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, so he laid the reasons out the way he'd lay out a ledger. The timing was too neat. The week was too specific. A woman appearing at that gate, on that night, with a story that couldn't be checked in the dark, and a disability that made her unthreatening and unaccountable both at once, was exactly the kind of instrument he himself would have chosen, if he'd been the one doing the choosing. He'd used sympathy as a delivery method more than once. He knew how well it worked, so he pushed. He asked her the same questions again, in a different order, an hour apart, the way you do when you're waiting for the seams to show. He asked her which hospital, and she named it. He asked her the name of the woman who'd canceled the check, and she said she didn't know which one of them had done it. He asked her 3 separate times to describe the old woman in town, and 3 separate times she gave him the same small handful of things, which was strange, because liars either give you less each time or more. She never once asked him for anything, not a phone, not a ride, not his name. She never asked his name, and by midnight that had begun to sit in him like a stone in a shoe. He told her to sleep. He put a blanket on the floor by the stove, and she thanked him for the blanket and nothing else, and she was asleep in the time it takes most people to decide they're comfortable, which is what happens to a body that has learned to take rest wherever it's offered. He waited until her breathing changed. Then he took her backpack off the hook by the door and carried it into the study and turned it out under the lamp. He was looking for a wire, a second phone, a burner taped into a lining, a card with a number on it, anything with a battery in it. There wasn't any of that. There was a plastic case of artificial tears, nearly empty. There was a hairbrush with most of its bristles gone. There was a paperback with the cover torn off, which meant nothing, because she couldn't read it. There was a notebook full of braille punched through with what looked like a nail, the dots uneven and crowded, the work of somebody who had taught herself out of stubbornness rather than being taught, and he ran his thumb over a page of it and understood none of it. And at the bottom, in a sandwich bag folded over twice, there were seeds. 6 little paper envelopes, hand-labeled by somebody with sight, soft at the corners from being handled. He sat with that bag in his hand for a while. He put everything back exactly as he'd found it, and hung the pack on its hook. And on his way through the kitchen he stopped, because something about her had been bothering him all evening, and he finally saw what it was. Her coat was ruined. Her shoes were split along one seam, but wrapped around her shoulders, over all of it, was a good olive wool scarf, old and soft and clearly cared for, and it didn't belong to anything else she owned. She was awake before he was, sitting up on the blanket with the scarf folded in her lap, and her hands still, waiting, not making a sound, which is its own kind of politeness and its own kind of judgment. He made coffee and put a cup down where her hand could find it, and she found it, and drank it, and said nothing about it. He'd already decided how this was going to go. He went to the study and came back and set an envelope on the table in front of her. And then, because she couldn't see an envelope, he took the money out and put it into her hand and closed her fingers around it, so there'd be no confusion. $4,000 in hundreds. And he told her what it was. He told her it would put her in a room somewhere with a lock on the door and hot water, and enough left over to get her through the winter, and that in exchange she'd forget the road, the house, and him. He'd handled 100 conversations like this one. There was a rhythm to them. The person's breathing changes first, then the hands, then the voice goes soft with a gratitude that's mostly relief, and then they say something about how they'll never forget this, and then they take it. She held the money for about 3 seconds. Then she put it back down on the table and slid it across the wood toward the sound of his breathing until it stopped against something. She said she couldn't take it. He asked her why not, and there was an edge coming into his voice now that he didn't like hearing. She said because he was paying her for the wrong thing. She said he was paying her to disappear, and she'd already done that for free, and she didn't want to be paid twice for the same job. She said if he wanted to do something for her, he could point her toward the state highway, because she didn't know which way it was from the door, and that was all she needed. Dante Ferraro stood in his own kitchen and looked at a stack of hundreds lying untouched on a table, and for the first time in 20 years he didn't have the next line ready. Men who owed him money had taken money from him. Men who hated him had taken money from him. A judge had taken money from him in a parking garage in White Plains without ever once looking up. He put the money back in his pocket. He told her to get her pack. He drove her out himself, because the alternative was watching her feel her way down that road with a cane, and he wasn't going to spend the rest of the week wondering. She sat in the passenger seat with the pack on her knees, and her hands folded on top of it, facing forward out of habit, at a windshield that gave her nothing. Neither of them said a word for 2 miles. There was only the sound of the wipers going back and forth, and the water under the tires. And once, far off, a crow. He didn't turn the radio on. He wasn't sure why. The road out ran along the shoulder of the lake, and then dropped down toward the creek crossing, and he knew before he came around the last bend, because he could hear it. The creek had come up in the night. The old timber bridge was still there, but the water was over the deck by 1.5 feet, and running brown and fast, carrying a whole birch tree sideways as he watched, and past the bridge the low stretch of the road had gone under too. A long sheet of moving water with a fence post standing up out of the middle of it. He got out and walked down to the edge in the rain and stood there a minute doing the arithmetic. The county wouldn't send anybody up a dead-end road for a private crossing. The creek would drop when the rain quit, and the rain wasn't quitting, and even after it did, the deck would have to be checked before anything crossed it. 4 days. 5, if the weather turned. He got back in the truck and told her. She didn't argue, and she didn't ask what happened next. She asked whether there was another way out on foot, and he said there was, if she wanted to walk 11 miles of logging track through country where he'd lost a truck once. And she said all right, and that was the end of it. He turned the truck around in the wet gravel and drove her back. He didn't say anything on the way, and she didn't either, and by the time the house came up out of the trees, he had built the whole thing back into a shape he could live with. She wasn't a guest. She was a delay. He parked and took her pack in himself and set it by the kitchen door, and then he stood in the middle of the room and gave her the terms, and his voice had gone all the way back down to the register men in Brooklyn knew. She would stay in the kitchen and the back room off it. She would not go past the second hallway. She would not put her hands on any door in this house except the 2 he had just named. He said he wouldn't tell her twice. She said she understood, and she meant it, and she kept to it, right up until the third day, when she got turned around in the dark and put her hand on a door at the end of a hallway that hadn't been opened in 19 years. She learned the house in 3 days, and she did it without asking him a single question. He noticed it first at the sink. The second morning she went from the wooden chair to the faucet and back without her hand touching anything, and he stood in the doorway with a cup going cold and watched her mouth move without sound and understood she was counting. 7 to the stove, 4 more to the sink, 11 back, but only 10 if she came around the short side of the table, and she took the short side after that, every time. She built the kitchen out of numbers the way another person builds a map out of streets, and once a number was hers, she never lost it. She was accurate about the things she could reach, and useless about the things she couldn't, and she'd found the difference by walking into them. He saw the bruise on her hip on the second afternoon, when she reached up to a shelf and her sweater rode. A bad one. Greenish. Older than this house and this week. He asked her, flat out, who taught her to move like that? She said nobody did. He asked what that meant. She said there was a program, and there had been a man from the county who came twice with a longer cane and a set of exercises, and after the second visit the family said it wasn't necessary, that she'd be looked after at home, and the man stopped coming and she never got a phone number for him. So she'd taught herself. She said it without heat. She said she'd learned the upstairs hallway of that house by walking it 200 times, and that the first 50 times she'd bled, and that afterward it was simply hers, and nobody could take it. Dante had known a lot of hard people. He had made a career out of being able to tell which ones were hard all the way through, and he found that he had put this woman in the wrong column on the first night and hadn't corrected it yet. On the third night the power dipped, which it does out there when the wind comes across the water, and the pump kicked, and something in the wiring surged and the house went dark. It made no difference to her. That was the thing that got him. He went for a flashlight, and by the time he had it, she was already up and moving, and in the dark, without light. She had the advantage over him for the first and only time. But the dark took his landmarks, and it took her counting too, because she'd counted the hallway from the kitchen door, and she'd started from the wrong side of the table. 10 paces where there should have been 11. She turned where she shouldn't have. She went down a hallway she'd never been in. One hand out, fingertips reading the wall, past one door, past another, all the way to the end where the wall stopped and there was a knob under her hand, cold brass, and she closed her fingers on it. He came around the corner, and the beam found her there, and something went off in his chest that he had no name for. He shouted. Not a word at first, just sound, and then her name, and then get away from that door, and the noise of it filled the whole hallway and came back off the walls. He crossed the distance in 3 strides and got her wrist and pulled her hand off the knob. And the thing that stopped him, the thing that turned him cold right there in the dark, was how little force it took. She weighed nothing. His hand had closed on her wrist the way it had closed on other wrists in other rooms, out of pure habit. And this one had come away like a bird, and he let go so fast it was almost like being burned. She backed up until her shoulders found the wall, like she had both hands up in front of her, palms out, and she was shaking. And she said she was sorry, that she'd miscounted, that she'd started from the wrong side of the table. She said it twice. He didn't answer her. He couldn't. He walked her back to the kitchen, with the flashlight held down at the floor, not touching her, and she followed the sound of his footsteps, because that was all she had, and neither of them said anything else that night. He didn't explain. She didn't ask, and that was worse, because she'd heard him shout like that and she still didn't ask, which meant she'd decided he was a man you don't ask. He went back after she'd settled. He carried a chair down that hallway and set it against the opposite wall and sat in it, facing the door, in the dark, with his elbows on his knees. He sat there through the small hours. He didn't touch the knob and he didn't take the key out of his pocket. He just sat there the way a man sits outside a room where somebody is dying. And when the window at the end of the hall went gray, he stood up, and his back hurt, and he put the chair away. Then he went out to the truck, where the signal came in off the ridge, and turned on the phone he wasn't supposed to be using that week, and called Leo Barone in Brooklyn, and said one thing: find out everything there is about a woman named Nora Hale. The 7th day came, and the phone rang out in the truck at 7:15 in the morning, and it was Leo. And Leo didn't lead with the report. He said, 11 years. He said in 11 years, Dante had never once stayed past the 7th day. Not for a funeral, not for a war, not the year the Bronx thing went sideways and they needed him in a room by Tuesday. He said the car was fueled, and Tommy was waiting at the turnoff on the far side of the creek whenever the water dropped. And then he stopped talking and waited, the way a man waits who has known another man since he was a boy. Dante looked back at the house through the wet windshield. He told Leo to send Tommy home. He told him to keep the phone on. Then he sat there a while with the engine running and the wipers off and the water crawling down the glass, and he did not examine what he'd just done, because examining it would have required a vocabulary he'd never been given. He found her out back an hour later, and he found her by following the sound of glass being moved. Behind the house, past the woodpile, there was a greenhouse that had been going down for years. Half the panes were gone. A pine limb had come through the roof in some storm and been left where it fell, and the whole east wall leaned in on itself like something kneeling. She was inside it. She had her coat off and her sleeves pushed up, and she was lifting broken glass out of a bed of soil with her bare hands, piece by piece, laying each piece in a bucket she'd found, feeling every inch of ground before she set her fingers down. He asked her what in God's name she thought she was doing. She said the door was standing open, and she'd smelled it from the yard. Wet dirt, she said. You can smell wet dirt under glass from 30 feet off if the wind's right, and it doesn't smell like anything else in the world. He told her to stop. He told her she'd open a vein in there and there wasn't a hospital inside 40 miles. She said all right, and kept working. He said it again, harder. She sat back on her heels and told him, without any temper in it at all, that she'd been told to stop doing things for 14 months, and that most of the people who said it had meant well, and that she was going to clear a path from the door to the back bench, because it was the only useful thing she could reach, and that if he wanted her out of there he was welcome to carry her, but she wasn't going to walk out on her own. Then she went back to it. He stood in the doorway with his jaw set, and didn't carry her. And after a while he found he'd picked up the other end of the pine limb without deciding to, and the two of them dragged it out into the wet grass together. She worked her way down the benches with her hands, and she named things as she went, quietly, more to herself than to him. Rosemary, she said, gone woody, 4 or 5 years unpruned but alive at the crown. Lemon verbena, dead. Scented geranium, and she rubbed a leaf between her fingers and held them up, and said it was the rose kind, not the lemon. Then she went still with her palm flat on the bench, and said that whoever built this greenhouse had loved it, because you didn't put in a raised bench at that height unless you meant to stand at it every day of your life, and you didn't run a water line all the way out here for a hobby. She asked whose it had been. Dante didn't answer her. He went inside. The report came through that afternoon, and Leo read it out slowly the way he did when he wanted a thing understood. Nora Ann Hale, born in Utica, no arrests, no debts anybody could find, no connections to any name they cared about. The fire was real. The nursery in Rye had burned on a Thursday night in September, and Julian Whitmore had died in it, and the county fire investigator had put it down to an electrical fault in under 3 weeks, which Leo said was fast. The check was real, and the stop payment on it was real, and it had a date on it. All of it checked. Then Leo said there was one thing that didn't. Her medical records were thin. Not missing, he said, and that was the trouble. Thin. 5 days in a hospital in Westchester, and almost nothing in the file from the second day on. No consult notes, no discharge summary worth the paper, like somebody had gone through it with a broom, and the billing had been handled by a corporate account rather than by insurance. And the account belonged to a company out of White Plains called Whitmore Development. Dante stood at the window and watched her out there in the ruined greenhouse, on her knees in the dirt, working by touch. And he asked Leo to say that last name one more time. Rocco Vitali called that night, and Rocco never called that week, and the first thing out of his mouth was a question dressed up as a courtesy. He'd heard there was somebody up at the lake with him. He said it lightly. He said he only asked because if Dante had company, the boys ought to know not to come up unannounced. And wasn't it good to hear he wasn't sitting up there alone for once? Dante said there was nobody, and hung up, and stood in the dark kitchen with the phone in his hand, and every warm thing that had started to grow in him over the past 3 days went out like a match in wind. Because there were 4 people alive who knew where that house was. 3 of them had no reason to speak, and the 4th was asleep by the stove, 20 feet away. A woman who had appeared on the one night of the year he was guaranteed to be alone and unarmed in every way that mattered. He built it out in his head the way he'd have built it if he were the one running her. You don't send a man. A man gets searched, gets recognized, gets found in a ditch. You send someone nobody frisks. You send someone who can sit in a kitchen for a week and be pitied. You send someone who can't identify a face in a courtroom, which makes her worthless to the government and safe for you. It was better tradecraft than anything he'd used in years, and the elegance of it was what made him certain. So he set the trap. He did it on the 4th morning, with the kitchen door open, and her not 8 feet away at the sink. And he made the call to Leo, standing where the sound would carry, and he said out loud that the container coming in through the terminal at Port Newark was moving Thursday night instead of Sunday, and that everything on the manifest was to sit until he said otherwise. Leo, who had worked with him since he was 19, understood inside of 2 seconds, and played it back flawlessly, and asked one clarifying question for texture. And Dante hung up and looked at her. She was rinsing a cup. She hadn't turned her head. She hadn't paused. And then he went cold, and he stayed cold for 4 days. She felt it that same morning. That was the thing about a house with 2 people in it. She'd learned the sound of him the way she'd learned the count from the table to the sink, and now the sound had changed. He didn't say good morning anymore. He didn't put the cup down within reach of her hand. He set it down 2 feet off and let her find it. When she came in from outside, he stopped talking, and the silence had a shape to it, a held quality, like a man with his hand over a phone. On the 2nd day, he moved his chair so that he was between her and the door. She noticed that. She noticed everything now, because she had to. She lay awake on the floor by the stove that night, and went back through every hour since the rain, looking for the thing she'd done. And she couldn't find it, and the not knowing was worse than any accusation would have been. She thought about asking. She got as far as opening her mouth twice, but she'd spent 14 months in a house where asking a question was treated as an accusation of its own, where every request had been logged and weighed and used, and she had learned a hard and useful lesson, which was that you can't defend yourself against a charge nobody has made. So she didn't ask. She went out to the greenhouse every morning at first light, because it was the only thing in that valley that was hers, and she worked the benches by touch, and cleared 6 more feet of glass out of the north bed, and found the water line under a foot of leaf mold, and traced it with her fingers, all the way to a spigot that turned. She was careful not to be in his way. She was careful to be exactly where she'd said she'd be. On the 3rd night, she heard him come to the kitchen door and stand there, and she kept her breathing even and let him look, and after a while he went away again. On the 4th night, it rained hard, and she thought about the road, and about 11 miles of logging track, and whether a person could walk it with a cane, and she got as far as putting her hand on her pack before she made herself lie back down. On the 5th day, the phone rang out in the truck. Leo set it fast and flat. The federal people had moved on a lot at the Port Newark terminal at 4 a.m, Thursday, exactly as advertised. But it wasn't the only place the story had gone. 2 of their own crews had been told to sit tight on Thursday. A shift change had been rearranged, and a man who had no business knowing anything had made a phone call from a bar on 3rd Avenue Wednesday night. The word hadn't come out of the Adirondacks. It had come out of Brooklyn. Dante Ferraro stood in the rain beside his truck, with the phone against his ear, and looked back at the house, where a blind woman he'd been treating like an enemy for 4 days was out in a broken greenhouse at first light, on her knees, clearing glass with her bare hands, asking him for nothing. And he understood 2 things at once, and only one of them was that she was clean. He never said he was sorry. He wasn't built for it, and anyway, an apology would have required him to explain what he'd suspected her of, and he'd have rather taken a beating than say that out loud in his own kitchen. So he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to pick up the phone and start moving money and names until a door opened somewhere. It took him 2 days. On the 3rd morning, he came into the kitchen and told her the creek was down, and the county had looked at the deck, and they were driving to Albany. She asked what was in Albany. He said an appointment, and she said she couldn't pay for an appointment, and he said nobody had asked her to. They drove the 2.5 hours mostly in silence, and she sat the way she always sat, hands folded, facing forward at nothing. The Danforth Eye Institute was a low brick building near the medical campus, and the woman who came out to get them was Dr. Miriam Kessler, 51 years old, gray, coming in at the temples, no makeup, no jewelry except a watch she checked twice while she was still shaking hands. She took Nora back alone. She kept her for the better part of 3 hours. When they came out, Kessler had a folder under her arm, and she sat the 2 of them down and talked directly to Nora, and not to the man who was paying, which Dante noticed. She said the injury was chemical, not thermal. She said whatever had been stored at that nursery, when the fire got into it, had thrown an alkali, most likely a strong lye, And lie doesn't stop at the surface the way an acid does. It keeps going. It had burned the clear window at the front of both eyes, and it had burned the ring of tissue at the outside edge of it, and that ring was where the body kept the cells that repair the window. Without those cells, the surface never healed clean. It scarred, and it kept scarring, which was why 14 months of drops had done nothing but keep her comfortable. Then she said the part that changed the temperature in the room. She said the back of the eye was intact. Both retinas were healthy. Both optic nerves looked normal on imaging. The camera was fine. It was the lens cap that had been destroyed. Nora didn't move. She asked, very carefully, what that meant. Kessler said it meant there was something to try. She laid it out in 2 stages, and she didn't dress it up. First, they'd have to rebuild the surface. And that meant a limbal stem cell graft, tissue from a donor, and immunosuppressive drugs afterward, for as long as it took. And there was a real chance the body would reject it, and they'd be back where they started. If it held, they'd wait. 4 months, maybe 6, until the surface was quiet and stable. Then, and only then, a corneal transplant. She said the odds were reasonable. She said that in her hands, with a bed this well prepared, she'd expect a decent result more often than not. And she would not put a number on it any more precise than that, because anyone who gave her a number was selling her something. Nora asked if it would be both eyes. Kessler said they'd start with one. Nora sat very still for a moment, and then she asked whether that meant she might see her own hands again, and Kessler said she thought it was possible, and that was the word that broke her. Possible. She had not heard it in 14 months. She'd heard permanent and irreversible, and we've done all we can, and she'd heard those words said kindly and said carelessly, and once said in a hallway to somebody else, while she stood 4 feet away. She'd built a whole life on the other side of those words. She put both hands over her face and cried, and it lasted less than a minute, and she apologized for it afterward. Dante didn't touch her. He looked out the window at the parking lot and let her have it. Kessler said she'd need to see the original records. All of them. The emergency room notes, the toxicology, the operative report if there'd been one, and she'd need them before she could schedule anything. Then she said one more thing, and she said it more slowly. She said the tissue would come from a donor, and the weight wasn't the problem. They had good supply through the bank in Rochester. The problem was never supply. Dante didn't understand what she meant by that yet. They went out to the front desk to start the paperwork, and the young woman there was pleasant and quick, and pulled up a form and turned the screen a little, and asked for a signature on the consent to release medical records, and then she looked at the file, and her face changed by about half an inch. She said she was sorry. There was a flag on the account. She said there was a legal notation attached to Mrs. Hale's file from the hospital in Westchester, and that the institute would need consent, but that it couldn't be Mrs. Hale's. It took Leo 11 hours to pull the file, and when he read it back over the phone the next morning, he read it twice, because the first time Dante told him he'd gotten it wrong. 8 days after the fire, while Nora Hale was still in a bed in Westchester with her eyes bandaged and enough sedation in her to keep her under, a petition had been filed in the Supreme Court of the State of New York, under Article 80, one of the mental hygiene law. It asked the court to appoint a guardian for the person and the property of an incapacitated person. The incapacitated person was Nora. The petitioners were her husband's mother and her husband's brother. The papers said she was unable to appreciate the nature and consequences of her own decisions on account of catastrophic injury and acute psychological trauma. There'd been a hearing she never attended. There'd been a court evaluator who visited once, on a day the file showed she'd been given something for pain, and whose report ran to a page and a half. The order was signed as temporary. It had been renewed 3 times since. And attached to it, in the property schedule, were the 2 things that explained everything. Julian Whitmore's life insurance, $1.4 million, payable to his estate, and the fire loss settlement on the nursery, filed and paid the following spring, $3.2 million, to Whitmore Development, both of them administered by a guardian. Dante sat with that for a long moment, and then asked the only question that mattered, which was whether the woman asleep in his kitchen knew. Leo said the file showed she'd been served, which meant an envelope had been handed to a blind woman in a hospital bed. Dante drove back to Albany alone the next day. He was very calm about it, which anyone who knew him would have found alarming. He sat down across from Dr. Kessler in her office, and he laid it out the way he laid out every problem he'd ever solved, in ascending order. First, he offered to fund her limbal stem cell program outright. No committee, no strings. a number he wrote on the back of a card and slid across the desk. She looked at it and left it lying there. Then he explained that consent was a formality, that the woman was 27 years old and could recite her own history better than half the people in that building, that Kessler had spent 3 hours with her and knew perfectly well she wasn't incapacitated, and that a form was a piece of paper and paper burns. Kessler said no. Then he stopped being pleasant. He told her, without raising his voice, that he was not a man people said no to twice, and that she had a practice and a license and a name on a building, and that things happened to all three. She heard him all the way out. She didn't lean back. When he finished, she folded her hands on the desk and said she wanted to be sure he understood what he was asking for, because she didn't think he did. She said if she took Nora Hale into an operating room without valid consent, 3 things happen. She loses her license, which means the next 400 people who need this surgery don't get it from her. The institute loses its tissue agreement with the bank in Rochester, because a bank doesn't ship to a place that's cutting corners, and every one of those donor corneas came out of a family's worst day and was given away for free. And Nora, she said, Nora wakes up with a new eye and a court order still hanging around her neck, and the people holding that order can walk into any hospital in this state and have her moved, medicated, and put somewhere he can't reach her, and they'd be within their rights, and he'd have handed them the reason. She said she'd seen it done. Then she said the thing he took away with him. She said he could buy this building. He could buy every building on this street, but he could not buy a signature that the law had taken out of that woman's hand, and there was exactly one way to put it back. And it wasn't money, and it wasn't fear. It was a courtroom, and a judge, and a very good lawyer. She said until he brought her that, the answer was no. And she said it looking straight at him, and she didn't look away first. Dante Ferraro walked out of that office and got into his car in the parking garage and did not start the engine. He sat there while the light outside went flat and gray. He had been 18 years old the first time somebody told him no, and he'd learned that afternoon what to do about it. And he'd been doing it ever since, and it had worked every single time. It had bought him judges and inspectors and a county coroner once. It had bought silence and land and men's loyalty and the roof over his head. And a woman in a white coat with a watch she kept checking had just explained to him, patiently, the way you explain something to a child, that the one thing he actually wanted in this world sat on the other side of a wall his money couldn't touch. He put both hands on the wheel and looked at nothing for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called Leo and said he needed the name of the best guardianship attorney in the state of New York, and he wanted a meeting this week. And Leo, after a pause, asked him to say that again. He came in from the water at dusk that evening with his shirt over his shoulder, and she heard the door and turned her head and said she could smell the lake on him, and then she said something she'd been carrying around for 2 days. She said she'd like to ask him for one thing, and she wanted him to say no if he wanted to, and she wouldn't ask twice. He said go ahead. She said the first night, when he opened that door, she'd heard something in the way he stood there. She said a person's voice comes off their chest differently depending on how they're holding it, and that his had come off a man braced for something, and she'd been wondering ever since what it was he'd been braced for. She asked if she could put her hands on him and find out. He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he pulled the chair around and sat down backward on it and told her where to stand. She found his shoulder first and worked out from there, and her fingers were careful, the way they were with the seed beds, reading before touching down. She stopped at the first one, a short ridge above the left shoulder blade, and asked. He said 19 years old, a stairwell in Bensonhurst, a man with a screwdriver who was faster than he looked. She moved down, a long one, low across the ribs, smooth and wide. He said that one was a boat hook, and that he'd deserved it. And she asked what he'd done to deserve it, and he told her, and it wasn't a story that made him look good, and he told her anyway. She found a cluster of small round ones near the spine and went still and didn't ask that one. He told her anyway. He said his father. He said he'd been 11, and after that he was careful about which room he was standing in. And Dante Ferraro, who had sat across from federal prosecutors and said nothing at all for 6 hours, heard himself talking in a quiet kitchen to a woman who couldn't see his face, and understood that he had never in his life done this before. Not with a wife, not with a priest, not with Leo, and that he was doing it now because she wasn't watching him do it. She finished at his collarbone, a small hard knot of tissue just under the throat, and she said that one felt older than the others, and he said it was the first. And she took her hands away and said thank you. Then she sat down and said it was her turn, and she'd tell him the part she hadn't told him. She said it was a Thursday in September. The nursery ran 2 acres of glass and a head house, and she'd stayed late to do the inventory because the winter order was going out Monday and nobody else was going to do it. She said she was in the back of the propagation house at about 9:30 when she smelled it. Solvent. Not fertilizer, not fuel oil, not anything that had a right to be there. She said, in a place like that, you know the smell of every building by heart, the way you know the smell of your own kitchen. And that head house smelled of peat and wet burlap and rooting hormone, and that night it smelled like a paint shop. She said she stood there with the clipboard in her hand and thought about it for maybe a minute and a half. And she'd had a minute and a half to walk out the door, and she didn't. She went looking for where it was coming from. Then she heard Julian outside in the yard. He was on the phone, and he was arguing, and his voice was up in a register she'd only heard from him twice in 6 years. She said she caught pieces. She heard him say it wasn't supposed to be tonight. She heard him say she's still in there. And she heard him say a name, and she stopped, and her hands opened and closed once in her lap. She said she couldn't get it. She said she'd gone after that name for 14 months, lying in a hospital bed, and then in a room at his mother's house, and then in shelters, chasing it around in the dark, and it sat just under the surface where she couldn't reach it, and every time she got close, it slid off. She said the sound was there. The shape of it was there. And then the propagation house went up, and after that there was noise and heat and the glass coming down, and someone had her by the arm, and then nothing for 5 days. Julian died in the yard, 20 feet from the door he'd come out of. She lived. She said the county investigator came to the hospital once, and by then the family had already given him the electrical fault, and he wrote it down and closed it in under 3 weeks. She said nobody ever asked her a single question about the smell. And then she said the thing that put a stone in Dante's chest and left it there. She said the only person in this world who knows what was in that building that night is the one person in this world who couldn't see it. It came up 2 nights later over nothing at all. He was washing a glass at the sink and he asked her, half turned away, how she'd found this road in the first place. And she said she'd already told him, a woman in town, and he said, tell me about the woman. So she did, and she told it slowly, because she'd been over it many times herself. She said it was the diner on the main street in Ridgemont, the one by the pharmacy, and she'd been sitting at the counter for an hour with a cup of water she hadn't paid for. A woman came and sat down beside her. Older, she said, 60-something, from the voice. She didn't ask questions the way people ask them. She just talked, about the weather and about how the diner had changed hands twice. And then she ordered soup and set it down in front of Nora and said, eat that. And Nora ate it. Nora said the woman smelled like lemon and lavender, both together, the way a person smells when they wash things by hand and keep sachets in a drawer. She said the woman's hands were rough at the knuckles. She said at one point she'd reached over and taken Nora's hand and put it against her own, so Nora could feel the ring she wore, an old gold band, worn thin, with a dent in one side. Nora said she'd asked about the dent, and the woman had laughed and said it had been that way for 40 years. And she'd never had it fixed. And then Nora said the strangest part was that the woman asked her where she was going, and Nora said she didn't know, and the woman went quiet for a long time, longer than was comfortable, and then she gave her the directions. Down the county road past the church, left at the fork where the guardrails bent, and then the dead-end road along the water. 40 steps from the gravel to the porch. She said the woman made her repeat it back 3 times. She said the woman took off her own scarf and put it around Nora's shoulders and told her that if the man opened the door, she shouldn't be afraid of him, and if he didn't open it, she should sit down and wait, because he would. And then Nora said the woman hummed something while she was tucking the scarf in. An old song, she said. Italian, she thought. She said it had stayed with her the whole way up that road. Dante asked her to hum it. She said she'd get it wrong. He said hum it anyway. So she did. It was a lullaby, slow, in 3. An old cradle song out of the South, and she got the first line and the second line, and then in the third line she went up where the tune goes down, one wrong note, and came back to the melody after it. The glass went out of his hand and broke on the floor. Nora startled and asked what happened, and he didn't answer her. She asked again. He told her to sing it once more, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, not anger, something with no floor under it. And she did it again. And she made the same mistake in the same place, because she'd learned it from somebody who made it there. He crossed the kitchen. He asked her where the scarf was. She said it was on the back of the chair. He picked it up and turned it over in the lamplight, and found what he was looking for on the inside corner. A mend in the wool, done by hand, done badly, the stitches too big and pulled tight so the fabric puckered. He stood there holding an old olive scarf in a kitchen at the end of a dead-end road, and his hands were not steady, and there was no expression on his face at all. Nora asked him what was wrong. She asked him 3 times. He said nothing. He put the scarf down and walked out the back door into the cold, and she heard his boots on the gravel, and then she didn't hear anything for a long while. He didn't come back in until after 2. He didn't sleep. She lay awake and listened to him not sleeping. To the chair moving. To the sound of a man walking the length of a room and turning and walking it again. And she didn't ask him anything else, because she had learned that about him too. He was gone at first light. He drove into Ridgemont, and he started at the diner, and he worked that town for 11 hours the way he'd work a name in Brooklyn, and he did it politely, which cost him something. The waitress remembered her. Older lady, quiet, came in most mornings, always sat at the far end, always paid cash. The pharmacist said she rented the 2 rooms upstairs over the shop, had for a few years, kept to herself, paid on the first. He said she'd given her name as Ruth Palmer. Dante went up the outside stairs and the door was unlocked, and the rooms were swept and bare, the bed stripped, the drawers empty, a dish towel folded over the faucet. The pharmacist called up from the bottom of the stairs that she'd moved out 2 days ago, and hadn't left a forwarding address, and had asked him to say she was sorry about the short notice. The flag on the file did what a flag on a file is built to do. When the front desk at the Danforth Eye Institute pulled up her record and pinged Westchester for the release, a notice went out the same afternoon to the Guardian of Record, automatically, the way a bank calls you when your card gets used in another state. Nobody followed her. Nobody watched the house. The name Nora Hale simply surfaced in a system after 14 months underwater, with a date and a facility and a county attached to it. And by Friday morning a lawyer in White Plains had it on his desk. Dante worked it out later, sitting in the dark, and it was the part he never entirely forgave himself for. The one thing he'd done to help her was the thing that told them where she was. They came on a Tuesday, the first week of December, a little after 10. He heard the vehicles before he saw them, 2 of them, coming slow up the dead-end road, and he went out onto the porch and stood there with his hands loose at his sides, a county car, and behind it a black sedan out of Westchester. Grant Whitmore got out of the sedan, 34 years old, in a good coat, and he had a folder under his arm, and he came up the gravel like a man arriving somewhere he had every right to be. Behind him came a deputy from the Essex County Sheriff's Office, a heavy man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather have been anywhere else, and a woman from a private care service in a fleece vest with a clipboard. Grant introduced himself. He was pleasant about it. He said he understood there'd been some confusion, and that he was grateful to Mr. Ferraro for the kindness he'd shown his brother's widow, truly grateful, and that the family had been searching for her for months and had been very worried. He said it warmly. Then he handed over the folder and asked him to look at the order, and said the deputy could explain it better than he could. The deputy explained it. There was an order of the Supreme Court of the State of New York, renewed on the 12th of November, appointing a guardian of the person and property of Nora Ann Hale. Guardian of the person included the authority to determine her place of abode. The order was signed. It was current. It had a raised seal on it. The deputy said, not unkindly, that he wasn't here to make trouble for anybody, but he had a court order in his hand and a woman inside the house, and the 2 of them were going to leave together, and he'd like everybody to keep it easy. Dante Ferraro had put men in the ground for looking at him wrong. In that moment there were 4 people on his gravel, and he could have ended all of them and been in Montreal by supper, and he stood there and did nothing, because the paper in his hand was stronger than everything he'd built in 20 years. She came out on her own. She'd heard all of it through the open door. She had her pack over one shoulder, and the cane in her hand, and she'd put the olive scarf on. She didn't argue, and she didn't cry, and she didn't ask the deputy a single question. And afterward, he'd think about that for a long time. How quiet she was, the way you go quiet when you've already learned that the noise doesn't help. The woman in the fleece vest took her elbow, and Nora let her. She went down the steps and across the gravel. Halfway to the car, she stopped and turned her head back toward the porch, toward where she knew he was standing, and she said his name. Just that. Dante. Not help me. Not don't let them. Just his name. As a question. As a hand put out in the dark to see if anything was there. And he opened his mouth and nothing came out of it. Because there was not one thing he could say in front of a deputy and a court order that wouldn't have made it worse for her later. She waited about 2 seconds. Then she turned back around and got into the car, and the woman in the vest closed the door for her, and they drove down the road with the county car behind them, and the sound of the tires on the gravel went on for a long time after they were out of sight. He was on the phone before the dust settled. By 6 that evening there were 4 cars in the yard, and 11 men in the house, and there was a bag open on the kitchen table with things in it that had no other use, and Dante was putting on his coat when Leo Barone came in the door and stood in front of it. Leo, 58 years old, who had never once in his life told him no. He said Dante's name twice before Dante heard him. He said, "Listen to me." He said, "Whatever you do tonight, that woman is still going to be blind in the morning, and there is not a thing in that bag that fixes it." He said, "If you walk out this door, you'll be a fugitive by Thursday, and every judge in this state will know your name for the wrong reason, and the only door left that could have opened for her closes behind you when you go through it." He said, "The doctor already told you." He said, "You can't shoot a court order." And then he said the thing that stopped him, quietly, with his back against the door. He said, "And if you get yourself killed tonight, who is left who even knows she isn't crazy?" He sent them all home. It took until 9 to clear the yard, and when the last taillights were gone, Dante came back into the kitchen and found Leo still sitting at the table with his hat in front of him, and he put the olive scarf down on the wood between them and told him to explain it. Leo looked at the scarf and didn't touch it. Dante told him about the diner, and the ring with the dent in it, and the lemon and the lavender. And then he told him about the lullaby and the note in the 3rd line, and Leo Barone put both hands flat on the table and lowered his head, and he stayed that way so long that Dante finally said his name. Leo said he was going to need a minute. Dante said he'd had 19 years. Then it came out of him in pieces, the way a thing comes out when a man has swallowed it so many times he's forgotten the shape of it. He said, "Your father called me in. He said it was the March you were finishing school. He said he'd found out about a box, papers she'd taken, and he wasn't the kind to ask a question twice. And he told me to take her out to the property in Dutchess County and handle it, and he told me not to come back and tell him about it after." Leo said he drove her. He said she sat in the front seat with her purse in her lap, and she knew the whole way, and she never once asked him for anything. Dante heard that, and something turned over in his chest. Leo said they got to the turnoff, and he pulled over on the shoulder and sat there with the engine running for 11 minutes. He said he was 39 years old, and he'd done 6 things in his life he couldn't take back, and he'd never done this one. He said he gave her $400, everything in his pocket, and a name in Rochester, and he told her that if she ever surfaced anywhere Salvatore Ferraro could find her, he'd have to do it after all, and she said she understood. And then she asked him one question. Leo's voice went out on him there, and he had to start the sentence twice. She asked whether the boy was going to be all right. Dante got up out of the chair. He walked to the far wall and stood with his back to the room. He said, after a while, in a voice that was almost level, that he had gone to a funeral, that he had carried a box on his shoulder at 18 years old, with 4 other men, and put it in the ground at St. Anne's, and stood there in the rain. That he had spent 19 years believing a thing that Leo Barone knew was not true, and that Leo had stood next to him at that grave. Leo said yes. Dante asked him why. And Leo, still sitting, still not looking up, said because your father was alive. He said if I'd told you at 18, you'd have gone to him inside of an hour. He said, you know what he was? He said he'd have killed her, and then he'd have killed you, and he'd have done it in that order so you knew, and then he'd have found himself another son. Leo said he waited. He said he waited for Salvatore to die, and Salvatore died 11 years ago, and then he waited some more, and by then Dante was sitting in Salvatore's chair, and Leo had begun to be afraid of a different thing. He said, I didn't know what you'd do to me, and Dante said, neither do I. And that was the truest thing said in that kitchen all night. He stood there and looked at the back of that old man's head and felt 2 things at once with equal force, that he wanted to put a hand on Leo Barone's shoulder, and that he wanted to break him in half, and there was no space between the 2 of them, and no way to choose, so he did nothing at all, which was the only mercy available. He asked one question. He asked if Leo had known where she was, and Leo said no. He said not once in 19 years, and I never looked, because looking is how they find people. Dante told him to get out. Leo took his hat and went, and the door shut, and the house was empty in a way it had not been empty even before she came. He didn't turn the lights on. He sat down at the kitchen table with the scarf in front of him and put his fingers on the bad mend at the corner, the stitches too big, pulled tight so the wool puckered, and he sat there while the wind came up off the water and the clock in the hall went around. He thought about a woman he'd never gotten to be angry at. He thought about 11 minutes on the shoulder of a road in Dutchess County. He thought about 40 steps from the gravel to the porch, and about who counts a thing like that, and how they'd know. And a little after midnight, there was a knock at the front door. 3 knocks, unhurried, the way somebody knocks who has been standing out there a while working up to it. He crossed the hall and opened it. She was thin, and her hair had gone white, and she smelled like lemon and lavender. Neither of them said anything for a while. He stepped back from the door and she came in, and she was smaller than he remembered, and she moved carefully, and she carried a cardboard file box against her hip with both arms around it. He took it from her because it was heavy, and she let him. And that was the first time they touched in 19 years, and it was over in a second, and neither of them made anything of it. She sat down at the kitchen table. He put coffee in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around it and didn't drink it. Then she told him. She said she'd taken a box out of the office in the house on Bay Ridge Parkway because she'd been trying for 2 years to find one thing in it she could use to get the two of them out, and she'd taken the whole box because she didn't know what she was looking at. She said his father found out inside of a week. She said he didn't shout. He sat her down in the kitchen the way she was sitting now and gave her a choice. And it was a real choice, which was the terrible part. She could be gone, completely, permanently, no letters, no telephone, never again. Or they could both go, her and the boy, and he'd see to it personally, and he described how, and she said she believed every word of it because she'd been married to him for 21 years. She said she took the first one. She said she has never once, in 19 years, been sure it was the right choice, only that it was the only one where he lived. Dante asked her about the funeral. She said Salvatore arranged it himself. A car went off the road on the Taconic and burned, with a woman in it, and no dental match on file that anybody bothered to pull, and a closed casket, and 11 cars in the procession. She said she'd read about her own funeral in a newspaper in a bus station in Rochester. He said he'd carried it. He said the 5 of them carried it out of St. Anne's, and he was 18, and he remembered the weight of it on his shoulder, and thinking that it wasn't heavy enough. And she put her hand over her mouth and made one sound. One. And took her hand away and got hold of herself, because she had promised herself in the car she wasn't going to do that to him. He asked why she hadn't come back after Salvatore died. She said she'd been in the church parking lot the day they buried him. She said she'd stood behind the fence at the edge of the lot and watched him accept condolences at 36 years old in his father's coat, and she'd watched the way men came up to him one at a time and stood a little too straight, and she'd got back in her car and driven home. She said, I could see him in you, standing there. She said, and I was a coward about it, because if I came to your door and found out that what I ran to save had turned into what I ran from, then everything I'd done was for nothing, and I'd rather have not known. So she stayed 40 minutes away. She said she'd come up to the far side of the lake 1 week every year, the same week, and sat in the car and watched the smoke come out of his chimney and gone home again. Then he asked her why now. She said the doctor in Glens Falls had told her in September. Pancreas. She said they'd offered her some things and she'd said no to most of them, and that the number they gave her was months, and not many. She said she'd come north to be near enough to see the smoke one last time and hadn't planned on anything else. And then she said there was a woman sitting at the counter of the diner with nowhere to be. Dante said, You sent her to me. She said yes. He asked her why. And Serafina Ferraro looked at her son across the kitchen table and said she needed to know whether he was still hers. She said, I couldn't knock on that door myself. I'd have been asking you to be kind to me, and any man will manage that for his own mother. She said, so I sent you somebody who had nothing, who could give you nothing, who couldn't even see your face to be afraid of it. She said, you could have shut the door. Then she said the sentence he would carry the rest of his life. You did shut it, and then you opened it again. That was all I needed. He put his head down on the table in front of him, and his shoulders went, once, and she reached over and put her hand flat on the back of his neck the way she used to, and neither of them said anything about it, then or ever. When he could talk again, he asked her about the box. She pushed it across the table. She said she'd carried it 19 years and never understood most of it, but that she'd read enough to know it was the only reason she was alive. He took the lid off. Ledgers, in his father's hand, going back 30 years. Loan agreements. A schedule of properties in White Plains. And on the 4th page down, an entry from before he was born. Seed capital advanced against a construction firm in Westchester County. and the name of the firm was Whitmore Development. He kept going. Halfway down the box, the handwriting changed, and the dates came forward into the last 2 years. And there were photocopies now, and wire confirmations, and a set of side agreements signed in 2 places. One signature was Grant Whitmore's, the other was Rocco Vitale's. He went at it 3 ways, and not one of them was a gun, and there were nights that winter when the restraint cost him more than any fight ever had. The first was a lawyer. Her name came out of Albany, a woman who had been doing guardianship work in that state for 22 years, and who charged accordingly. And she read the file for 2 days before she said a word about it. Then she told him what they had. A petition under Section 81.36 of the Mental Hygiene Law to discharge the guardian and terminate the order on the grounds that the incapacity no longer existed, if it ever had. A demand for an independent capacity evaluation by a physician of the court's choosing rather than the family's. A request that the court appoint its own evaluator, and that the evaluator interview Nora alone, outside the facility, without anybody from the family in the building. She warned him that judges don't like to be told they got one wrong, and that the fastest way to lose was to make it about the money, and she told him to stay out of the courtroom and let her do it. He didn't like any of that. He did all of it. The second was fire. He hired a private investigator out of Syracuse, a retired fire marshal, and turned him loose on a case the county had closed in under 3 weeks. The man went and stood in the burned shell of that propagation house in December and came back with 3 things. A copy of the original report, in which the words electrical fault appeared 11 times, and the word accelerant appeared nowhere. And no laboratory analysis had ever been ordered on anything. A purchase record from a chemical supply house in Yonkers. 30 gallons of industrial solvent, ordered under a Whitmore Development account 4 days before the fire, delivered to a job site that had been closed since August. And a set of subpoenaed telephone records showing that a call was placed to Julian Whitmore's cell phone at 9:41 on the night he died, that it lasted 6 minutes, and that it came from a number registered to his brother. The third was quieter. Dante had every page of his father's box photographed and made into 2 identical packages, and one went to a field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Manhattan, and the other went to a reporter at a paper in Albany who had been chewing on Westchester development contracts for 4 years without enough to print. Both packages went unsigned, from a copy shop off Central Avenue, and no one ever learned where they came from. Leo drove them down himself and didn't ask a single question the whole way, and all that time, 60 miles south, Nora Hale was doing the only work available to her. They had her in a private care residence outside White Plains, and it was a clean place, and the staff were mostly decent to her, and her door didn't lock, but the hallway door did. They took her telephone the first day. They said it was policy. She asked for it back every morning for 9 days and then stopped asking, because asking was how you told them what you wanted, and she decided to stop telling them anything. What she did instead was count. From her bed to her own door, 6 paces. Left along the corridor to the fire stair, 22. Right instead. And it was 31 to the day room, and 44 to the front hall where the carpet stopped and the tile started. And she could tell the tile under her cane from any other floor in the building. In 11 days, she had the whole ground floor in her head. Every room, every doorway, the loose board outside the medication room, the fact that the west windows got sun at 2:30, which meant west. She knew which aide walked in soft shoes, and which one wore a watch that ticked. And she listened. That was the part they never thought about. And it was the mistake every one of them made. All of them. Always. They talked in front of her the way people talk in front of a chair. She heard a woman on the phone in the office at the end of the corridor say that the family had asked for the monthly to be billed against the estate account, rather than the trust. She heard someone say the word settlement twice in one afternoon. She heard an aide tell another aide that the brother had called again about the renewal date, and that he'd asked whether there was anything in the chart about a doctor in Albany. Every night she took out the notebook and the nail she'd carried in that pack through 8 months of shelters, and she wrote it down in Braille, punching the dots through the paper by feel in the dark, uneven and crowded, and perfectly legible to exactly one person on earth. The date, the time, the words, as close as she could hold them. She had 11 pages of it by the 2nd week of January, and when a court-appointed evaluator finally sat down across from her in a room with no one else in it and asked her, gently, whether she understood why she was there, Nora Hale put her hand into her bag and took out a notebook full of holes and said she'd like to read him something. The hearing was held in the Supreme Court of the State of New York, County of Westchester, on the last Thursday in January, in a courtroom on the 3rd floor, with a ceiling fan that turned whether it was needed or not. Dante sat in the back row and said nothing the entire day, which his lawyer had made him promise twice. Catherine Whitmore went first. She was 63, and she was very good, and she never raised her voice once. She said the family had taken Nora in when there was nowhere else for her to go. She said the poor girl had been badly hurt and had never really come back from it, that she'd become confused, that she'd wandered off in the fall and been missing for months, and turned up living with a man in the woods that nobody could account for. She said she understood how it looked. She said guardianship was a burden, not a benefit, and she'd carried it because somebody had to. She talked about Nora for 11 minutes without ever once saying anything to her, and the whole time she used the same tone a woman uses about a house that's gone past repair. Then the court-appointed evaluator gave his report, and it was 4 pages, and he had done his interview alone in a room in a public library in White Plains. And he said in plain language that in his professional opinion, Mrs. Hale possessed full capacity to manage her own affairs, and had likely possessed it for some considerable time. Then Nora's attorney asked the court to hear from Nora herself. She stood up. She asked the judge if she could say something about the room first, and the judge, after a moment, said go ahead. She said there were 19 people in that courtroom, 20 with him. She said the fan was behind her and to the left, about 10 feet up, and it had a click in it every 4th revolution. She said the court reporter was directly in front of the bench and slightly to the right. She said the gentleman in the 2nd row on the aisle had changed the crossing of his legs twice in the last minute and was wearing hard-soled shoes, and that a woman 4 seats down from him had a purse with a metal clasp. She said the door at the back had opened and closed once since she stood up, and then she said she was sorry, but she'd found that people needed to be shown, because they had all decided in advance what a blind woman was. Nobody in that room said anything for a moment. Then her attorney asked her about the night of the fire, and Nora told it. And she told it in a flat, exact voice, times and places, what she was holding, where she was standing, and when she came to the smell, she said the thing that had never once appeared in the county's report, and her attorney handed the court the purchase record for 30 gallons of solvent, ordered 4 days earlier on a company account, delivered to a job site that was closed. Then Catherine Whitmore's attorney got up and went after her the only way left, which was to say that a woman who could not see could not possibly know who was in that yard or what was said, that she'd been sedated, that she'd had 14 months to build a story out of a smell. He pushed her hard for 6 or 7 minutes. He asked her to admit she couldn't identify a single voice from that night with certainty, and Nora stood there with both hands on the table in front of her and went back into it, further than she'd ever let herself go, the yard and the dark and her husband's voice up in a register she'd only heard twice in 6 years. And the thing that had been sitting just under the surface for 14 months came all the way up into the light. She said Julian said a name. She said it was Grant. He said, Grant, I'm not doing this. And the courtroom went very quiet, and somewhere behind her a chair moved. She waited until it was quiet again, and then she said the last thing she had to say. And she said it to the judge, and not to anyone else in that room. She said she'd lost her sight. She said she hadn't lost her memory, and she hadn't lost her voice, and she hadn't lost her right to be a person. She said all she was asking the court for was the ability to sign her own name to her own life. The judge ruled from the bench that afternoon. He found that the standard for continued guardianship had not been met, discharged the guardian, terminated the order in full, and directed that an accounting of the estate and the insurance proceeds be filed with the court within 30 days. He said one more sentence before he left, about how this file should never have looked the way it looked, and he said it to the lawyers and not to the family. The rest came in its own time, and not in that room, because a court that decides whether a woman can sign her name doesn't decide who set a fire. In March, the Westchester County District Attorney indicted Grant Whitmore on arson in the 2nd degree, insurance fraud, and grand larceny. In April, the federal government indicted Rocco Vitale on 19 counts, and it was another 11 months before Dante learned which page out of that box had done it. He never fired a shot. He never made a call to a judge. He sat in the back row of a courtroom with his hands folded and watched a blind woman take her own life back with nothing but her memory and 11 pages punched through with a nail. And in 37 years he had never won anything that felt like that. She signed her own name to the consent form on the 9th of February, and it took her a while, because she had to be shown where the line was, and she wanted to do it without help after that. Dr. Kessler did the limbal graft on the right eye 4 days later. It was not a long surgery, and it was not a dramatic one. And afterward, there was a shield taped over her eye, and a schedule of drops every 2 hours, and a bottle of immunosuppressants she would have to take for as long as the tissue lasted. Kessler warned them both, plainly, the way she did everything. She said the first month is the month. She said if the body's going to turn on it, that's when. 3 weeks went by and Nora did everything she was told. And then on a Thursday night at the end of the month it turned. It started as heat behind the eye, and by 10 o'clock she had a fever of 103, and by midnight she wasn't entirely in the room anymore. And this was the thing nobody had thought to prepare her for. She had lived 14 months in the dark and made her peace with it. And she had built a whole architecture of counted steps and remembered smells to stand on top of. And a high fever takes that away. She couldn't count. She couldn't hold the shape of the room. The floor moved. And for the first time since the fire, she was truly blind, without any of the tools she'd built. And she panicked, the way she hadn't panicked in the hospital or in the shelters or in the house in White Plains. She was calling for someone. She didn't know she was doing it. She was saying his name over and over into the dark, and he was already there, and he took her hand and put it against his chest so she could feel that it was somebody solid, and he told her he was there and he wasn't going anywhere. He said it about 400 times that night. She'd quiet for a while, and then she'd start again, asking if he'd left, and he'd say no, and put her hand back where it had been. He sat in a chair beside that bed from midnight until the window went gray, and he never once let go, and he never once left the room, not for coffee, not for the phone, not for anything. Around 5 the fever broke, and by 6 she was asleep properly, and Kessler came in at 7:30 and looked at the eye and said the graft had held, and that they'd gotten ahead of it, and that it would probably be all right. Dante stood up out of that chair and his legs almost didn't take him. There was another thing going on that month, and it happened in a room down the hall. Serafina had been told in September what she had, and she'd said no to everything they offered her, and she'd meant it. She told her son that she'd made her arrangements a long time ago, and she'd rather have 4 clean months than 7 bad ones, and she wouldn't discuss it further. And then, in the middle of February, Nora, who had been at that time exactly 9 days out of surgery, with a shield taped over her eye, asked to be walked down the hall, and she sat on the edge of Serafina's bed and held her hand and said one thing to her. She said, "When they take the bandage off in June, you're going to be the first thing I see." She said, "I've been picturing your face for 4 months, and I want to know if I got it right." And Serafina Ferraro, who had refused 2 oncologists, a priest, and her own son, sat there for a while, and then said all right. She started palliative chemotherapy that same week. She was very sick from it, and she never complained about it once. And when Dante asked her why she'd changed her mind, she said it wasn't complicated, that she'd been given a reason to be somewhere on a particular day. They brought Nora home to Coldwater in the middle of March to recover, and the night before, Dante went down the hallway alone with a flashlight he didn't need. He stood in front of that door for a while. Then he took the key out of his pocket, the one that had lived there for 19 years, and it went into the lock stiffly, and he had to work it, and then it turned. The air that came out was dead and cold, and smelled of dust and old wool. Everything was exactly where it had been. The bed made, her brush on the dresser, a cardigan over the back of the chair, a book face down on the nightstand with a page turned over, waiting for a woman to come back and finish it. He stood in the doorway a long time. Then he went and got a bucket and a stack of clean linen, and he opened both windows and let the March air come in off the lake for the first time in 19 years, and he took the sheets off that bed and washed the floor on his hands and knees and wiped down every surface in that room, and he did it slowly, and he did it alone, and he didn't hurry it. He put the cardigan away. He left the book where it was, and when he was done, at about 4 a.m, he carried Nora's things in and set them on the dresser, and left the door standing open behind him. The corneal transplant was done on the 18th of June, and 8 days later they came back to Albany to take the bandage off. Kessler pulled the blinds and brought the lights down until the room was nearly dark, and she explained that it would be blurred at first, and bright, and that it might take weeks before it settled, and that nobody should expect anything in the first minute. Serafina sat on Nora's left, in a wheelchair by then, with a scarf over her thin hair. Dante stood back against the wall. Kessler worked the tape loose and lifted the shield away, and told Nora to open when she was ready. She didn't, not right away. She sat there with her eyes closed and her hands flat on her knees, and then she opened them. There was light, there was shape, and then out of the blur the shape resolved into a face. And it was an old woman's face, thin, with white hair and dark eyes, and Nora looked at her for a long moment, and then reached out and touched the ring on her hand, the old gold band with the dent in one side, and said, "It's you." Serafina put both hands over her mouth. Then Nora turned her head. He was still standing back by the wall where he'd put himself, and she looked at him for a good while without saying anything at all, longer than was comfortable for him, taking in a face she'd built for 8 months out of a voice and a way of moving. Then she got up and crossed the room, and put 2 fingers on the small, hard knot of scar just under his throat, the first one, the one she'd found in a dark kitchen a lifetime ago, and she said, "So that's what you look like." He wrote a letter that summer. The I-Bank in Rochester passed it along without names, the way they do, to a family in Erie County who had lost somebody in April and had said yes on the worst day of their lives. He wrote it by hand, and it took him 4 evenings and a great many discarded pages, and it was the first thing he had written by hand since he was 18 years old, the year he carried a casket out of St. Anne's in the rain. Serafina died in August, on a Tuesday morning, in her own room at Coldwater with the windows open and the lake going gray and silver outside them. She'd had her 4 months and then some. She went quietly, a little before 7, and Dante was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hand in both of his, and Nora was in the doorway, and there was nothing left unsaid between any of them, which is the only mercy that matters at the end. 3 years later there is a nursery on 11 acres outside Ridgemont, with a sign at the road, and the beds are all raised to the same height, with a lip you can find with the back of your hand, and every label is punched in Braille, and the whole place is laid out by scent, so that a person can walk it by nose alone. Mint at the gate, rosemary at the turn, lavender along the long path to the glass house. Nora teaches there. Most of her students can't see. She tells them on the first morning that she was taught by nobody and learned by walking into things, and that they're going to do better than that. The first seeds she ever put in that ground came out of a paper envelope she'd carried in a backpack through 8 months of shelters. Dante is out of the parts of the business that would have put him in a cell, and it took 2 years and cost him a great deal. And what's left is the port work and the construction, and it's all on paper that can be looked at. Leo runs most of it now. On the porch at the lake house, there's a baby asleep in a bassinet in the shade, and her name is Serafina, and she's wrapped in an old olive wool scarf with a bad mend in the corner. The stitch is too big, pulled tight so the wool puckers. Nora sings to her out there in the evenings. It's an old Italian cradle song, slow, in 3. And in the 3rd line she goes up where the tune goes down. 1 wrong note, every time. On purpose now. The door at the end of the hallway stands open. The key is in the lock and it's never turned, and that's the whole of it. A woman with nothing knocked on a door in the rain, and a man who had everything opened it, and neither of them knew what they were doing. What this story asks us to sit with, I think, is a simple and uncomfortable thing. The people who threw Nora Hale away never once raised a hand to her. They did it with clean paper and polite voices, and a signature she wasn't allowed to give. They looked straight at her, and decided that a woman who couldn't see was a woman who couldn't think, couldn't remember, couldn't be trusted with her own life. And it was that decision, and not the fire, that nearly finished her. Because the dignity of a human being was never about how much they can see. It's about whether the rest of us are willing to see them. Every one of us knows somebody who has been talked about in the 3rd person, while sitting right there in the room. An aging parent, a sick friend, someone the world has quietly written off. It costs us so little to speak to them instead of about them. If this story reached something in you tonight, please give it a like, and share it with someone who could use it. Subscribe to our channel to hear a new story with us each day. And I'd love to know what you felt while you listened. So tell me in the comments, has there been a moment in your own life when someone chose to really see you? Or when you chose to really see someone else? I read every one of them, and they mean a great deal to me. Thank you for spending this time here. I wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet, happy days. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video.